you are very eloquent people. So, I mean, maybe 5 to 7 minutes is fine, or 10. If you want to sort of give the big picture on the importance of public diplomacy and the, the sort of sad state of affairs.
Yeah.
And Tom certainly would, I think Haroon is going to talk about the strategic plan at the BBG, and since you were part of the you wrote the whole thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on that, but also maybe in your studies of the State Department of some remarks on how reform is needed there.
Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy that you've seen that mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And, of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Our panel discussions today will be led by two of my colleagues. Our first panel will be led by Hella Dale, who was Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Our second program portion will be led by Peter Brooks. He serves as Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs in our Allison Center. Leading our program and making opening remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce our founder of the Heritage Foundation, former president, Edwin J. Fulner. Dr. Fulner.
Thanks very much, John Hilbolt. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm honored to be able to kick off this very important seminar on public diplomacy, which has more than passing interest for me personally, because for 12 years under the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and even into the Clinton administration, I had the honor of serving as chairman of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. And I learned a lot, both in the field from some of the most outstanding individuals I've ever had the opportunity to work with inside the U.S. Information Agency and the Department of State around the world, and from my colleagues, both here at Heritage and on this panel, actually, because it was some 10 or 11 years ago, I think, that John Lenchowski invited me to give a course on public diplomacy at his institute, an event I still fondly remember. Because of the knowledge of this audience, I will spare you the usual opening paragraph of defining public diplomacy, other than to say that unlike traditional diplomacy, which is government to government, we view public diplomacy as people-to-people diplomacy. Let me get right into the subject. American public diplomacy has faced many challenges over the decades, but never have we had to engage in the war of ideas on as many fronts as we do today. At the same time, our capabilities and institutions in this field have deteriorated significantly, and they urgently require bolstering and upgrading. That's the reason we at the Heritage Foundation have convened today's event, Public Diplomacy Challenges for the Trump Administration. Here at the Heritage Foundation, we continue to believe profoundly in the power of ideas. It's as important as ever, and the ideas that we share and would like to share with individuals around the world are as central as ever. During the Cold War, the Reagan administration confronted the ideological challenge from the Soviet communist regime. Thanks to the insights and determination of the man we call the great communicator, President Ronald Reagan, and his director of the U.S. Information Agency, Charlie Wick, we were able to meet that challenge. We served the people of countries trapped behind the Iron Curtain with truth, news, and ideas about human rights, free markets, and democracy. These ideas were anathema to communist dictators. Then, in 1989, the Iron Curtain's most visible symbol, the Berlin Wall, fell, and millions of citizens of Central Europe were suddenly free and were able to rise up against their internal tyranny. Soon there was no Soviet empire, and the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. In the light of this achievement, some in the U.S. government made an unbelievably short-sighted decision. Our government decided to declare victory and unilaterally disarm. In 1999, the government closed the doors of the U.S. Information Agency, the government's powerhouse of ideas, and the home of the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and the other iconic U.S. public diplomacy programs. Supposedly, the end of history was at hand, and we in the West had won. Well, not so fast. Communism was demonstrably a failed ideology, but Chinese ambition, Russian nationalism, and the violent Islamist ideology soon revealed themselves as major threats to the international structure. Yet the world's leading power, the United States of America, had unilaterally disarmed in the battlefield of ideas. Today, the number of aggressive foreign actors serving to influence Americans and foreign audiences has multiplied. In addition to the traditional tools of influence, broadcasting, print media, now through cyber warfare, the internet, social media, these actors have gained new platforms and tools to spread their poison. Russia, under recently re-elected President Vladimir Putin, has for years sought to destabilize free and fair elections here in the United States, in Europe, and among our allies around the world. Russia is investing heavily in disinformation campaigns abroad to sow confusion and dissension wherever it can. Simultaneously, People's Republic of China over the last decade has created global news networks, daily newspapers in many languages, and is increasing itself in its presence on academic campuses all over the world with its well-known Confucius Institutes. And terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have mastered the internet for propaganda and recruiting on a comprehensive major scale. Countering all this would be the job of American public diplomacy institutions, both governmental and NGOs, to address. However, we barely have any governmental public diplomacy capability left. Public diplomacy has been part of the State Department since 1999, and alas, it has all but disappeared. Last week I had the opportunity to be both in Asia and in Europe and saw firsthand some of the challenges that public diplomacy faces with depleted budgets, shortened staff, and challenges on many fronts. On a personal note, as an involved participant in public diplomacy, both for the U.S. government and for this, the Heritage Foundation, a major NGO, under the last 7 administrations, 7 presidents of the United States, in various formats, both here in the United States and overseas, I have stated on many occasions that, quote, in the United States, we only have one president at a time, and that it is incumbent on governmental agencies involved with public diplomacies to accurately reflect and support that president and his policies. The current situation must change if we are to persuade other countries of the power of our democratic ideas, of sharing the liberties Americans enjoy, and of the importance of values that raise each person to the dignity she or he deserves. We must win in this new war of ideas for the sake of this great country, for the sake of future generations of Americans, and for the sake of our friends and allies the world over. I commend our discussants on both panels today for sharing and talking about these issues in a candid and constructive way. I look forward to the combined results of what we come up with today, and I thank all of you for being here with us. Thank you very much for coming to Heritage. Ella?
Thank you, Dr. Follner, for framing the subject that we'll be discussing today. Our first panel is a powerhouse of ideas. Three speakers who have distinguished records and deep insights into U.S. public diplomacy, past, present, and possibly even future. Our first speaker will be John Lenczowski, the president and founder of the Institute on World Politics, a highly regarded graduate school for international and security studies, where public diplomacy is also taught as a subject. Dr. Lenczowski was a member of the National Security Council under President Reagan. His focus was Russia policy in part, but he was also, he told me to remind everyone, he was the vice chair of an interagency unit, an interagency international broadcasting committee for the NSC, and in that capacity helped coordinate the government's public diplomacy and broadcasting efforts. So his background goes way back, and his understanding of what happened successfully under the Reagan administration is obviously firsthand. Dr. Lenczowski was also, or is, the author of Full Spectrum Diplomacy, an influential book on public diplomacy and its key importance for U.S. foreign policy. Our second speaker is Haroon Ullah. He is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Broadcasting Board of Governors. As such, I believe he had a certain amount to do with the new strategic plan for the BBG, which came out just last week. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing some remarks on where that will take us. He was formerly with the Office of Strategic Planning at the State Department. Our last speaker, Tom Hill, is a visiting fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. However, he was previously, not so long ago, on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Royce. That was the committee that initiated the reform legislation of, actually, I think both the BBG and the Global Engagement Center of the State Department. So Tom has also played a major role in how these institutions will be reformed, hopefully, or shaped in the future. I will turn the word over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much, Hella, and good morning, everybody. I just would like to say that I'm honored, Ed, that you started this this whole panel and that you're here to attend it. It is. I would just like to say that I very much second all of your remarks, which are absolutely central to U.S. foreign policy, and I'm very grateful to the Heritage Foundation for taking the time and effort to put this seminar together. I would like to just talk a little bit today about this, a little bit more about the strategic importance of our public diplomacy capabilities, and specifically our international broadcasting capabilities. I have lamented for a very long time that we have in this country a very materialistic foreign policy culture, where if it isn't guns and money, it somehow isn't strategically important. And you can always get big interagency meetings, a National Security Council meeting to discuss some military assistance packages, maybe economic sanctions, big trade deals, and so on and so forth. And you never get any discussion about relations with people. We just care about relations with government and we care about business, but we don't care about relations with and influence over people. And one can argue that relations with people over the long run may have ultimately a more powerful influence over the world, and including influence over the governments in question. In the Department of State, the culture in the State Department is such that they do not care about relations with people. Excellence in public diplomacy is not rewarded. It continues to be a second-class citizen in the overall U.S. foreign policy structure. And I don't think that this is going to change until the incentive structures within the Department of State are changed such that people are rewarded, are given ambassadorships, are given assistant secretaryships when they demonstrate excellence in public diplomacy. This is a fundamental structural and cultural problem in our foreign policy that will continue to fester until there is State Department reform along these lines. Let me just observe here that during the Cold War, the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that our international broadcasters, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America, were the most powerful weapon that we possessed in our entire foreign policy and national security arsenal. Well, I like to say, scratch your favorite foreign policy expert in Washington, D.C., and ask him or her to explain what Solzhenitsyn was talking about. How this possibly could be the most powerful weapon when we have nuclear weapons, when we have armies and navies, when we have SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative during the Cold War, when we have economic sanctions and a mighty military buildup that bankrupted the Soviet Union and all that. Why should broadcasting be the most powerful weapon? Well, there's a reason why. And especially when you're dealing with tyrannical nations, which tend to be the ones that are aggressive against the United States and our friends and allies around the world. I would just like to give an example here of one of the current challenges we're facing, which is with North Korea. I don't think we're ever going to solve the North Korean problem by any other means than regime change. The problem is not the mere possession of nuclear weapons. The problem is who possesses the nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons were a problem in and of themselves, we should be rushing to the arms control table with the British. But we don't need to, because the British are our allies, and they're not fundamentally threatened by the American concepts of political legitimacy, where the North Korean regime is. And so how do you bring about regime change in a tyrannical government? How did we bring it about in the Soviet Union? Well, in war, Clausewitz explains that you attack the enemy's center of gravity. And the enemy's center of gravity is that without which he cannot conduct war. It's that without which he cannot survive. But in North Korea, what is the center of gravity? It is its internal security system, and which consists not only of its informants and its gulag and all of that sort of thing, but its monopoly of communications and information, by which it controls people's thoughts, their speech, and ultimately their behavior. Combine that monopoly with the ideological party line, and you have the drum beating by which the soldiers have to march. It is the instrument of enforced conformity. And so therefore, in order to break this, in order to get the people to rise up and bring about political change internally, they have to be able to communicate with one another. You know, when in the Cold War, we had the sanctions. We helped the Mujahideen defeat the Red Army in Afghanistan. We supported anti-communist movements in other places around the world. We had our military buildup. We lowered the oil prices in order to deprive the Kremlin of their hard currency earnings. But how does any of that explain how 1 million people can take to the streets of Moscow and demand radical political change? Especially in a country where if you demonstrate, you're going to be whisked away by the local police and sent to the Gulag. Well, what explains it was that our broadcasts and our communication, including presidential rhetoric to the peoples of the Soviet Empire, helped break the monopoly of information. It took time. And it broke the atomization of society, which is another one of those critical elements that serve the internal security system of tyrannical states, where people are all separated from one another because of the climate of fear and mistrust and enforced conformity and thought control. And they cannot trust each other, and therefore they cannot create internal cells of resistance. But when we had a broadcasting capability, such as with VOA, RFE and RL and so on, the Solidarity movement, for example, in Poland, could develop underground lines of communication to the West to let us know about, and to let their own people know about the very fact of their strikes. And whenever there's a civil disturbance in these countries, the regime, the first thing they do before they crush the disturbance is they cut off all communications to where that disturbance is taking place. And so our broadcasting capabilities undermined all of this. Let me just say something about this. The media are so important. We understand how important they are in our own society. We seem not to understand how important they are internationally. And yet here we are, as Ed said, all of the disinformation, the fake news, the subversion, the active measures, all of this, using the social media, using the bots, the troll farms, and all of this stuff. Everybody is in this business except for us. We never fund these things according to national strategic need. The entire non-military side of U.S. foreign policy is underfunded and doesn't get the national strategic attention that it deserves. And then let me just say one or two things, some details about our broadcasts. We've been witnessing the steady destruction of the Voice of America. We stopped the Russian service. We stopped Hindi to India, Portuguese to Brazil. We stopped the Arabic service. Yes, we replaced it with a rock and roll station and with television Al Hura. There is a lot of, they were going to try to stop all broadcasts to China over the Voice of America, amazingly enough. There has been confusion, of course, between the fundamental missions of the VOA and the surrogate radios, the freedom radios, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. But the point that I would like to make here is we need to be broadcasting to all the world, all the time, in as many media as possible. Some people say, well, not everybody listens to shortwave. Well, we've got to send in TV, and the internet is the answer. Well, China has more internet police than they have members of the People's Liberation Army. And you cannot surf the web anonymously in any of these totalitarian countries, North Korea and the others. And so therefore, what we need to do is make sure that there are anonymous ways by which people can receive the messages, alternative ideas, accurate news, and their history, their religion, whatever it is that's being deprived, they're being deprived of. And I would just, along these lines, there is a digital revolution that has happened in broadcasting, and that is called DRM, Digital Radio Mondiale. And it is a method by which one can broadcast, send a signal from American territory without the benefit of relay stations all the way around to the other side of the globe with a crystal clear signal where you not only send sound, but you can send text and video, and the people who receive it can see this stuff anonymously. And I would just like to urge our government to make the investment in DRM technology, start broadcasting in it, and giving people the incentive to manufacture DRM receivers. We should be flooding the world with reception technologies, as well as flooding the world with our broadcasting, with our broadcasts. We have to revive the entire concept of having relations with and influence over people. And I could continue for a much longer time, but I thank you for letting me abuse your welcome.
Which you did not do. Thank you, John, for your eloquence. Harun, you can speak from here, wherever you prefer.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to also thank Dr. Fulner for your leadership and for Hella for putting this together, and John for making a lot of really good points. So my name is Harun Ullah. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you here today. And this subject is both personally and professionally, I'm very passionate about it. And so, I am as the Chief Strategy Officer at the Broadcasting Board of Governors. And as John rightly pointed out, this is such a critical time. In fact, I think we're on what I call an information battlefield. And, a place like Pakistan, for example, which has 45 nuclear weapons, what they do is they shut down our bureau because they understand the weaponization of information. So the Radio Free Europe bureau is shut down in Islamabad. And I can go on and on with examples talking about this idea of how important information statecraft is. Now, I have to say, it's an exciting time to be at BBG because of the type of reforms and the way that we have now starting to execute and implement the national security strategy. And for those that, as Hella, thank you, very kindly pointed out, we came out last week, which is available on our website, the new strategic plan, 2018 to 2022. And this plan that we came up with is a sort of a data-driven strategy that thinks very carefully about our mission on this new, what I call information battlefield. And oftentimes we'll get the question, well, what do we do? What do we do at BBG? What is the purpose of BBG? And as many of you might know, our mission statement is to inform, engage, and connect in terms of spreading freedom and democracy. But even more specifically, and I'm a little biased about this because I used to sit on the other side. I helped draft this national security strategy. I used to work on Secretary Tillerson's staff at the State Department and worked very closely with the NSC and with Dr. Nadia Shadlow. And for the first time, we have in our new national security strategy lifted information statecraft. It is now a key part of what we are doing. And if you look at, for example, pillars 3 and 4, advancing American influence and preserving American peace through strength. Information statecraft, for the first time, is now a really key component of how we think about foreign policy. And our new strategic plan is integral. We have woven in sort of, into the main areas, this main strategic priority. So we are, as the BBG family, we're the BBG family is Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Radio Free Europe. We are covering so much all around, Voice of America, and so and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. So we are reaching 290 million people per week, and we're trying to reach the key audiences. So I want to give you sort of what I think of are sort of the 3 highlights in terms of our strategic kind of, where are we headed? So the first, as I told you about, was the national security strategy. We are implementing that. We are aligning in terms of the pillars 3 and 4. And again, for the first time, we're taking a data-driven approach to thinking about North Korea, thinking about China, thinking about Russia. That's some things that John brought up. How do we counter ISIS, right? What are the new ways that they are putting both content and distribution together, right? How are we challenging, how are we doing in Cuba? So we're on this information battlefield, as we understand, there are no longer borders. There's no borders on this battlefield, right? And this is one of the key pivots we see in our strategy, is that we are moving from a country-based model to what I call a language-based model. We are now thinking about, as John rightly pointed out, on this new information battlefield, when you think about all the different platforms, there's not necessarily beaming into a country, beaming out. There's, for example, large diasporas of Farsi-speaking audiences in Indonesia, in the Gulf. Russia is a top 5 spoken language around the world. So it's no longer just in countries where we're looking at diasporas, we're looking all over the place. So that requires a very different way of looking at what I call audience architecture and audience segmentation. Now, we're taking a data-driven approach. So what we're trying to do is trying to say, as we have this now national security strategy, we think about what are the right audiences? Who are we trying to reach? So while we have 290 million people that we're reaching, are we reaching the right people? Are there more people out there that we need to be reaching? Are there others voices that we need to be enabling as part of our mission? So and the mantra here is, if you understand the sort of global media space, is the following: the narrower the audience, the bigger the impact. So if you think about it, you have to think very carefully about what audiences are we trying to reach. Are we trying to reach that 18-year-old in Moscow that just finished secondary school? Are we trying to reach the 21-year-old single mother in Jakarta? Are we trying to reach the young 15-year-old that's reading comics that ISIS is putting out sitting in Cairo, Egypt? So part of this is thinking about those networks, because in a lot of ways, and I write a lot about this. I had a book that came out in November called Digital World War, which it's good to be back here at Heritage. I launched here at Heritage. It was published with Yale University Press, where I look at this. I did research on this digital battlefield, on this information battlefield, about what works from a data-driven perspective. And I'll give you one example. Many of us we know that how important countering ISIS is. We know how important it is to counter their hateful rhetoric. Does anyone know the #1 person on Twitter in the Middle East? Any guesses? Anyone know?
Donald Trump.
No? Well, no, he is very popular in the Middle East, but I'm talking about somebody from the region. Who is it? Okay, it's close, but no. So it's not a politician, it's not an actor, or it's not a musician. It's a religious cleric, an extremist religious cleric based in Saudi Arabia named Mohammed al-Arafi, who has 20 million followers. Okay, 20 million followers. 60% of Saudi youth find him. He's based in Saudi Arabia, and he's probably the single biggest driver of why young people join ISIS. So when you talk about countering disinformation, it is about looking at key influencers. It's looking at who is the vulnerable audiences that he is reaching. And when we talk about our Middle East Broadcasting Network, which is one of the ways that we've pushed back against this, which is one of the premier channels, we're doing Arabic language content. We have now designed programming to reach those audiences. We have something called Raise Your Voice. We have something that talks about ISIS defectors, that talks about those stories, that talks about the voices of victims, that talks about their journey, because we know from a data-driven perspective, those audiences that is the type of narrative that they're hearing from people like Mohammed al-Arafi. Just to give you a sense of Mohammed al-Arafi, he sits right underneath Ed Sheeran and right above Hillary Clinton as the top followers in terms of top Twitterati around the world, between number 58 and 59 in the world. He has enormous influence. And my point in sort of just giving you that example is we have to think about who are the audiences that we want to reach in terms of our storytellers. And we really do have some incredible storytellers with a mission that are out there putting themselves on the line, as John said, in a number of places. We have 5 journalists right now as we speak in prison, a number that are under pressure, that have been harassed, that their families have been in prison. So I'm a field person. I spent 10 years in South Asia, about the same amount of 10 years in the Middle East. I think about what is that challenge on the ground. the best messaging is never going to come from DC. The best messaging is going to be relying on our journalists in the field who are close to sort of those issues, because as we recognize, all content is local in many ways. So we have to sort of think about how do we leverage that. Now, I want to sort of pivot a little bit, and I want to tackle a couple things. So this is the way I thought about sort of, as I said, it's a very exciting time at BBG. And oftentimes when I go around, people haven't all heard about BBG. Sometimes when people say BBC, maybe it's something else. I say, no, we're Broadcasting Board of Governors, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Alpha Q Broadcasting, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Voice America. But part of it is that I oftentimes am dispelling myths. There's myths about BBG, about what we do. We're an $800 million global media agency, agency that's competing with everybody around the world. And we are storytellers with a mission. So what I want to start with you today as a lead into this really great conversation with, I can't think of a better panel, is the 5 myths about BBG. So I want to sort of tackle what I think of are the 5 myths. These are things I oftentimes hear in my conversations and with things that I talk about with people. So myth number 1, we are too slow in our reforms and in our modernization. Okay, so oftentimes you'll hear this time and time again. As BBG, we're too slow. We're not moving fast enough in terms of our reforms, that we're not reaching the right people. Okay, and I would say actually that's not the case. And I'm so glad Tom's here, because his previous boss, Chairman Royce, and others on the Hill have been real drivers, real catalysts working with us in terms of leading a lot of the reforms. And I'll give you examples. We recognized early on about what the Russians were doing, as John pointed out, in this disinformation space, right? The Russians had sort of had the playbook. And if you look at it in a lot of ways, the Russian playbook and the ISIS playbook is very similar. The way that they use computational tactics, the way they use first mover advantage, the way they think about their audience architecture has a lot of similarities. So back in February 2017, after a lot of research and data-driven sort of approaches, we launched something called Current Time as a response to that. How many here have heard of Current Time? All right, we have a couple. Okay, good. So Current Time, which is a collaboration between Voice America and Radio Free Europe, and it was designed at taking on the Russian public broadcasting. So not just RT and Sputnik, which oftentimes we hear about, but the real elephant here is the multi-billion-dollar Russian public broadcasting, right, that is spreading disinformation. And this was Russian language content, over 35 programs in over 20 countries, a digital broadcast that would sort of take those issues on head on. We just got done wrapping up around the clock election coverage, 16 straight hours of election coverage, and the numbers were through the roof. But just to give you a metric of how we responded to that and put that channel together, in the last year, anyone want to guess how many digital views we've had? Anyone want to guess? We've had 400 million digital views in the last year, okay? Over half of those, 200 million, come from within Russia. And I can give you, I've done my doctoral work in methodology and game theory. I can tell you the specific audiences that we're reaching. And we are reaching the key audiences. RAND just came out last week with a report on a social media analysis that was done there. And they cited one of our social media associated with Current Time as one of the top 5 influencers in that region. And just I want to leave you with this anecdote to talk about, again, how we responded. Anybody watch Sleepers? No? Come on, we need to have someone watch Sleepers. So Sleepers is a Russian drama that is akin to sort of their version of Homeland or The Americans. Okay, and about 2 weeks ago, in the drama that they had, is that they were talking about an American agency that was a sort of thorn in their side. They really hated this American agency that was in public diplomacy and in doing information statecraft. And you know what the name of was in that episode? What did they call that American agency? Current Time. That's an anecdote you want to take in terms of how we are on the map. The Russian drama that's the most popular drama right now in Russia put Current Time as their number 1 enemy. And I have a number of other anecdotes and both data in terms of how we're being effective. That's one example about our reforms. We just had Elon Berman that came in, who's a close friend and colleague. We had a number of people, and thanks to the chairman, that said, look, we need to be doing better in reaching Farsi language audiences. We need to do better, okay? We, as Elon, with a number of other people, we commissioned a report for them to look at this, to look at our content, to look at the types of things in terms of our distribution. They came up with a report, and we are taking those things to heart. We've seen significant changes now in terms of how we approach our Farsi language content through PNN, our Persian News Network at Voice of America. And in the latest protests that we had at the Iran protests, we were the top 5 ranked globally. We had built this infrastructure. We interviewed Vice President Pence. We had interviewed Secretary Tillerson. We had interviewed a number of people from the NSC, people like Joel Rayburn, who helps run our Iran policy there. But we got on a number of leading experts. And the point, what I'm trying to get at, is that we were one of the top 5, our live blogging in terms of reaching audiences, was getting the voice of those dissidents and those citizen voices that were not heard. This is examples of how we are getting better and we're moving in much quicker space. Now, I'm gonna be very open, since I think we're sort of extended family here. Dr. Fulner's here. We need to do better in Mandarin. I'll be the first to say it. And we are committed to taking a data-driven approach, like John said, to sort of thinking about what are ways. Now, there's a lot of difficulties. They won't allow us on satellite. It's very difficult to get on cable. I study transmedia. They'll try to block it, as John rightly pointed out. But we are doing things. Under my leadership, we have something called the Office of Internet Freedom, and we're giving out circumvention technology for people in China, people in Iran, in those places where they're shutting down telecom providers to access our content. And it's in the millions. I can give you the data of how many people are now accessing it. So we're looking for ways of how to sort of increase our reach and our impact, but we want to do better. And that's an example of how we are. So that was myth number 1, that we're too slow on modernization forms. Myth number 2, that we want to cut radio. How many times I've heard this? A lot of times I'll speak to people and they'll say, oh, you guys are trying to cut radio. You guys are trying to cut this specific language. You guys are you're behind the curve on this. Now, I actually think that's the wrong question. The right question, and based on what John said and what Dr. Fulner opened it, is what audiences are we trying to reach? Now we have this national security strategy here with information statecraft for the first time being on the front and center. What are those key audiences that we want to reach? In North Korea, in Farsi speaking diasporas, in the Russian periphery, in Cuba. What are those right segments? Is it 18 to 25-year-olds in Havana? Really thinking about audience segmentation. That's the first question we ask. Then the second question is, once we determine what audiences we want to reach, who are the key influencers, how do we reach them? That's a tactic. How do we reach them? Is it radio? Is it DRM, which is also a good idea? Is it through satellite? Is it through cable? Is it through digital? Now, it could be all of the above, but that to me is a tactical. Now we get into the tactical. The strategic part is what audiences we want to reach. And that's the process that we're trying to go through. We're trying to look at, okay, through this language service, this is how many people we reach, this is how much we're spending. Is that the best allocation of resources? Because like a lot of the interagency, we have to do more with less. We have to do more with less. So oftentimes we're gonna have to think of new effective ways that right now, as we speak, the president's management agenda is just being released, and we're ahead of the curve with the OMB in enacting some of those reforms. It's actually just being released right now. So no, we don't wanna cut radio. We don't wanna cut any language. I would wanna keep every language service, but we have to oftentimes make hard strategic decisions about where we broadcast and where we don't. We're trying to reach those key audiences as outlined in the National Security Strategy. Myth number 3, I hear this a lot, that at BBG we're all bureaucrats. We're all bureaucrats. We're not good storytellers, okay? I understand that. Look, yes, we are a government agency. I understand the inclination towards that. But I'm gonna tell you what, we have a number of Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. We have a number of journalists that have won international awards. We have our bipartisan that's elected our leadership. Our CEO had spent 10 plus years running one of the largest TV networks in the US and globally, Scripps TV. We have our chairman, the CEO of the Hudson Institute, and is really acutely aware of sort of thinking about how do you think about audience architecture. Look, oftentimes people call me, I'm a bureaucrat. Maybe I take that as a compliment, but I was part of a production that won a Peabody Award. I've written 2 books on digital media and on content. Like I've also done it. I've been in the field. So we have incredible storytellers with a mission in BBG. And oftentimes I think we forget about those are the people. I say there's no other greater honor than standing behind the flag And we have storytellers all over the world that under incredible duress, look at CPJ and others that cite the number of our journalists that are under pressure that do that at quite a bit of risk. So the question is, no, we're not all bureaucrats, although I take that as a compliment if we are, but we are storytellers with a mission, and we have an incredible amount of talent. Number 4, we're not effective. We're not effective, that we're not moving the needle. So you'll hear this a lot. We're not effective, okay? In the shop that I run, that I work on, is that we have 40 indicators in what I call an impact model. Both qualitative and quantitative indicators we are tracking, okay? I'm a nerd. I'm a data-driven person. I will go on and on about our data, about how we're moving the needle. And I can show you not just that we're collecting all this data, but we're not just moving the needle on attitudinal changes. I can show you that we're actually measuring behavioral changes. We look at trust. Do people are more willing to protest, to participate in rallies? We look at actual actions that people take. And I can tell you in a number of these language areas, as we move from this country-based model to language-based model, we are moving the needle. We have huge impact. We have the president met with a number of our journalists that were defectors, that were for Radio Free Asia. We have, our Farsi language broadcast was cited by a lot of the international news organizations as top 5 in terms of live blogging. Chairman Royce just sent us a letter this past week commending our reforms and some of the work that we're doing. Because people recognize what we're doing. We have data that shows that we have moved people that were willing to go to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS. So I have data that shows that we're reaching the same audiences that Mohammed al-Arafi is reaching through our programming and ISIS defectors, through our programming and showing what's the reality of life under ISIS. What are the voices of mothers that are doing? What is the content that we can enable that criminalizes those insurgency groups? So we are moving the needle. I can show you the data. We want to do better, but because I want to be, as part of BBG, we want to be very ambitious. We do not want to sit back and sort of just be content. We want to be the premier global media agency in the world. And that's my last myth, is that we're not competing with RT and with Sputnik and with CCTV and others that are in that space. We're absolutely competing. And in fact, there's something called the DG7, which looks at other public funded broadcasts of Deutsche Welle and BBC and others that we sort of form a coalition with. But we, as many of you know this morning, the Chinese, in recognition of some of our work, launched something called Voice of China, right? They put in enormous amount of money in terms of combating some of our work around the world, because the Chinese know that we are incredibly influential in markets like Africa and other places. There's now more Mandarin speakers in Africa than any native African language, for example. So they've started something called Voice of China. Again, time and time again, we're on that battlefield because we understand how important content is and the type of things that we need to do. So I want to leave you with that, those 5 myths, and excited to be part of this discussion.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Fulner. And thank you, Hella, for putting this together. That's a hard act to follow. I'll do my best. But I do want to say at the outset that I was very glad to hear all of our panelists and Dr. Fulner raise this issue of public diplomacy, because I can tell you that it's not always unanimous that our broadcasting elements, our broadcasting entities are a part of U.S. public diplomacy. That, surprisingly, is still sometimes in debate or up for debate. And I'm also really glad to hear Haroon talk about some of the work he's doing, because for far too long, the BBG would provide numbers on audience reach that really don't mean anything. As Haroon points out, 290 million people a week, who cares? It's which 290 million? Where are those people? What is the audience segmentation as he describes? So I'm really glad to hear him lay out his vision for it, because it's a dramatic leap forward from where the BBG has been. As you'll recall, only 5 years ago, Secretary Clinton called the agency defunct. So it's important that someone be at the helm leading the movement into a modern organization that understands how to target and how to use limited resources better. And that's really where I want to begin my talk, is on this use of limited resources. Because it's not an organization that's driven by commercial structure or advertising revenues the way a private sector media corporation is. That's both liberating and it's somewhat constraining. What I would say is that there continues to be an issue of where do we want this organization to go in terms of U.S. taxpayer dollars? And as we saw over the last 10 years, there's been report after report, GAO, IG, former governors, Congress, employees of the organization. They have felt like the organization is not performing at max capacity. And when I was on the Hill, the charge was, can we make this organization more functional? Can we use those limited resources more productively? And in order to do that, I think you have to pull back from some of where the discussion is this morning and answer a more fundamental question of, if you're going to talk about reform of the agency, ultimately, I think it comes down to answering one question. What do you want the Voice of America to do? You have the surrogates and the Freedom Radios, and their mission is fairly parsimonious. It's easy to understand. It's easy to communicate to others, right? They provide news and information in closed societies where an indigenous free press does not exist. Easily understood. Voice of America's mission is much more difficult. As former Chairman Jeff Shell said to me one time, he saw the three parts of the so-called charter in contradiction. And so what you have ended up with is an organization inside Voice of America that at various times has emphasized one or two of the three parts of the charter in varying degrees. It's very rarely that all three parts are being implemented or advanced equally. And for those unfamiliar, so the three parts of the charter are part one, Voice of America will serve as a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news. VOA will be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. Part two, Voice of America will represent America, not any single segment of American society, and will therefore present a balanced and comprehensive projection of significant American thought and institutions. And the third part, Voice of America will present the policies of the United States clearly and effectively, and will also present responsible discussion and opinion of those policies. Now, I would say to the first part, this idea of VOA news will be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think there's a problem with the use of the word objective, just in general. I like to think of Hunter Thompson, the famous journalist who in the 70s, I think it was 1972, said, there's no such thing as objective journalism. The phrase itself is a pompous contradiction in terms. But I don't want to get bogged down in this idea of relativism, et cetera, but I point that out as an issue. Certainly, Voice of America does a much better job at the second part of its mission, right? They do a great job of representing America in general, I would say. But there is a problem with that, and I would say it's in this third part, presenting the policies of the United States clearly and effectively. It's the effectively part that I think is where this all starts to boil down. In my mind, effectively means towards the ends for which the policy is intended. So are they advancing U.S. foreign policy? That's the public diplomacy part. Is the Voice of America advancing effectively U.S. national security policy? And I'd say that in general, the VOA has been opposed to this idea. They've wanted to be considered just news. There's often a repeated trope about this need for a firewall, seemingly walling them off from any discussion of U.S. national security or foreign policy matters. I would just say that the firewall idea, A, is not in law. This is in a conference report that was in legislation in the past. It's not binding. But the idea that you cannot have journalistic independence while also not advancing national security goals and objectives, I just find incomprehensible. And if you look back at the other legislative elements from the '94 Act, it's very clear that there is an attempt to align Voice of America with U.S. foreign policy, right? The '94 Act says, number one, the first thing that Voice of America will do is be consistent with the broad foreign policy objectives of the United States. Seems very clear to me. The second part, it says, to provide a balanced and comprehensive presentation of U.S. thought, institutions, culture, society, and government policy. So when when Voice of America pushes back on this idea that they should be out as a critical element or a critical tool of U.S. public diplomacy, I find that deeply problematic because it doesn't seem consistent with the legislation that supports the mandate. I think it's been pretty clear from Congress's point that they don't want Voice of America to compete with MSNBC or CNN or BBC. That's not their job. Because they have an alternative funding mechanism, they have great freedom to run stories that don't have to be, if it bleeds, it leads. They can write the stories because they know it's important for U.S. foreign policy, not because they're trying to attract the greatest number of eyeballs. And that, I think, is incredibly liberating for the organization, but it's not a philosophy that's typically embraced. Oftentimes, and I think this is where the criticism is you will see or hear Voice of America people say, well, we want to report on these stories because they're the stories that our audience wants to hear. Well, sure, but if you're reporting on a drone strike story in Yemen, U.S. drone strike story, Al Jazeera is covering that, Al-Manar is covering that. You have any number of other outlets that are going to cover that story. And it may be appropriate to also have Voice of America to cover that story. But that should also be mixed in with other things the U.S. government is doing that the other networks aren't covering, right? So Al Jazeera is never going to tell its viewers about the thousands of girls who go to school in Afghanistan today because USAID built schools and trained teachers and provide books. Al-Manar or Press TV, which is the Iranian state-sponsored television, are never going to tell you stories or tell their audience stories about what USAID did in Iraq to help farmers learn to irrigate their farms better so that they could feed people so that there wasn't a catastrophic famine. Or any number of outlets are not going to talk about how Americans, just average citizens, not government employees, but just private citizens, through the goodness of their heart, picked up from the United States, went to West Africa to help in Ebola relief. The United States is an incredibly philanthropic country. We do a lot of work around the world. We spend almost $56 billion a year in foreign assistance. There's a lot of good stories. And so VOA doesn't have to only report the same things that CNN or BBC or others are doing. There's a whole world of stories that are not being covered that explain what else America does in the world besides a drone strike. And that is their field where they can play, and they are totally unchallenged. So they have free reign to pick any story in that space they want, and that really is advancing U.S. foreign policy. And I don't see that as a directive that somehow infringes upon this idea of journalistic integrity or journalistic independence. I see this as VOA fulfilling the mandate that they've been given by Congress. I would also say that, well, I'm sure we'll get into it more about Voice of America as we talk more about it. But I do think that if there is going to be an effort by the White House, which seems to be clear from the president's March 2017 executive order, to fundamentally rethink many of the government agencies that we currently have. There has been legislative efforts in the past. As with all legislation that have been proposed, it's not perfect. And I do think that there's an opportunity here, if the White House supports it, to really push the envelope on BBG reform. In the past, BBG reform has suffered from, I would say, apathy, not because of a strong objection to the policies that are proposed per se or the reforms that are proposed per se, but because there's a lack of appreciation for what BBG does. And as Dr. Lenczowski pointed out, this is critical. And so if the administration is serious about getting into this space and competing with other countries in the war of information, definitely reforming the BBG would be an element in that. And with White House support, more far-reaching legislation than what has currently been proposed or was proposed previously could also be pushed. But I think in order for that legislation to really have an impact, it all has to start with answering this question: what do you want Voice of America to do? How do you want that organization to look? Once you answer that question, all of the other questions I think about reform start to become more clear. And whether you divide the agency, whether you consolidate the agency, whether you fully privatize, whether you fully federalize, all these other questions can't be answered until you first figure out, what do you want Voice of America to do? And so that's where I'd like to see the administration go if they are serious about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. if I could add a remark before we open the floor up to questions. It seems to me that none of this will really ultimately have the kind of impact that it should if the White House itself does not engage in pushing for these reforms, formulating the ideas. I'm very encouraged to see that the strategy that Haroon described meshes with the national security strategy, which I think it absolutely has to do. We've written this many times here at the Heritage Foundation, that public diplomacy is part of U.S. foreign policy. But I wanted to just briefly to ask any of you, and obviously Haroon, do you see the White House deeply understanding and engaging in that kind of, communication or on the communication battlefield of the world at the moment? That understanding is there.
The short answer is yes. I actually interact more with the NSC now than I did when I was on at State Department. They're almost every week briefing various regional directorates and others that care about this issue. We have a number of folks there that are thinking about this. They're wrapping their heads around this. Nadesh Yadlo wants to run a information statecraft pillar, which is basically bringing the interagency together, where we'll have a seat at the table. At one of those sessions, I sat with Dr. Lankowski, who knows more about this than most in terms of how to do this. So I found them to be very receptive. Now, on a very strategic level, we expect at some point for them to announce a nominee, which we'd very much welcome. And I see our work and our both bipartisan board and our current leadership as trying to, as best to sort of, as we carry out this vision to set things up, going forward in the future. And so, we have, I think, a fantastic roadmap. I mean, I'm biased, I really do. And Tom, you brought up a lot of good points, and you've been a huge advocate, and we wouldn't be here today without a lot of the work that you did with Chairman Royce and others. And I do think that Voice of America, has been taking on this challenge. I think in a lot of ways, I think a little bit is that when I hear about what you mentioned, I think it reminds me of a lot of discussions we had in the past, which is a little bit like how maybe Voice of America was back, many years ago. But I do think we've turned a corner. We have, as Voice of America has, in terms of the mission, we've done the Extremism Watch Desk, which is now averaging over 800,000 views per video they put together. This is criminalizing Boko Haram. It's criminalizing, who's here? Anyone here seen the Extremism Watch Desk? You should go up there and look up the channel. The Voice of America's Extremism Watch Desk, an incredible resource. I know some of the people that are working on there because I knew them from Afghanistan and Pakistan and in the field. Some of the best journalists that are putting together, they're almost like a BuzzFeed against extremism. And what they're doing is they're putting in pieces of content that are going viral, small videos, memes, ways of sort of getting to these young audiences, really innovative stuff, and has incredible metrics through the roof. Voice of America just did a Boko Haram documentary, some of the best work, won awards. We had exclusive coverage of what's going on in Boko Haram, and the documentary is now, again, it's now going to be in all Nigerian public schools coming out in the next year. So you talk about impact, it's huge, some of the content that we're getting. I talked about some of the work Elon knows and others that if you watch, and as for somebody who speaks Farsi, if you watch some of our coverage, we are criminalizing the IRGC. We are talking about the corruption of what's going on. That's why our live blogs were so popular. We were actually vetting the citizen voices of people that were upset about what was going on in their country, both there and around the world. And that's why that content was so powerful. So I think in so many ways with the current time, we have so many examples of how Voice of America is really at the front edge. And I think a little bit of what you talked about is kind of like the way we think about our uncles of Voice of America. That used to be maybe how it was many years ago. John knows that yes, maybe in the past we lost maybe our way at some point, but really I think it's become refocused. And I feel that it's a data-driven perspective. Look, a room of us here can come up with anecdotes about what we think coverage should be. But I really think as somebody, we have to think carefully about both the qualitative and quantitative. We have to look at impact. We have to look at audience architecture and who are those audiences we want to reach, which was your original question.
Okay, well thank you. Let's see if we have anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question. And if so, please identify yourself by name and affiliation, please.
Hi, I'm Chen Weihuan, China Daily. So I would be fall into the category, say, the Chinese influence probably. I just want to offer a perspective, the question is really,
One question preferably.
yeah, would you, so actually welcome, the international broadcaster, whether from China, Russia, or other country. The thing I think I want to make a very brief comment. It's like, if you only watch Fox News and not MSNBC, or if you only watch MSNBC and not Fox News, you are well misinformed in this country, I would say. So I would say you will be well informed if you watch France 24, CGTN, CCTV, even RT or Jazeera. So I think you should think, because American TV never really reported like Africa, given the different perspectives. So
But people do have the freedom to watch any of those
yeah, but you,
shows. I mean, they're on our cable networks. I don't think there is a dearth of foreign
know,
media.
it's like, in the Washington DC think tank, which I go a lot. The only shortcoming is when you talk about China, there is always not a Chinese on the panel. So that's actually, you should welcome the Chinese participation, Russian participation, French participation, whoever they come from. You can disagree with
I'm
them,
really
but you
glad you're
should let
here,
them
but
participate.
can I just ask you, if you
Okay.
have a question, you can ask it now, or else, let's have someone else
Yeah,
have a
I
chance.
just say, is there sort of you see as a value for, international media to be here in the U.S. rather than see them as a hostile sort of a threat? Thank you.
Does anybody want to take that on?
There's a difference between journalism that has some kind of that has some kind of integrity and that which is official state propaganda. And there is a distinction between trying to represent the United States on the Voice of America and to defend its policies. And there's a distinction between that and propaganda, because propaganda is a word which doesn't have a neutral connotation anymore. It is a word which implies the manipulation of truth. And what we're getting out of the official Chinese media and out of RT is propaganda.
And I'll just add, I would welcome reciprocity, for American journalists and other international journalists that want to report on in China, which there is none, essentially. We're not allowed in China. This is why I think America is an example to the world, because we allow journalists, Chinese journalists, to be here to report, CCTV and others, but there's no reciprocity there. So to me, that's the starting point.
May I just observe that we give China something like 830 visas for your so-called journalists to come to the United States, and you give the Voice of America 2 visas, and will not give a third one for the VOA to have a correspondent in Shanghai.
Okay, anybody else with a question? Yes, down here in the front.
Thank you. Matthew Wallen from the American Security Project. I focus on public diplomacy at that institution. We've talked a lot about the BBG and broadcasting in general from an advocacy perspective. We are telling the world America's story, but equally as important as doing that is telling the world's story to America and to Americans so that we understand how our influence abroad works, how people interpret our policies, why they may object or agree to those policies, and how we actually build relationships overseas. And relationships are two-way experiences. They have to see value, we have to see value. So what elements can we expand upon to increase that? I've noticed in the president's budget for exchanges were cut by nearly 2/3. And I'd say exchanges are probably at least equally as important as international broadcasting. So what can we do, whether that's from a broadcasting perspective or from a general public diplomacy perspective, to increase the aspect of listening to the world and understanding how to create more effective policies?
Well, I agree with you that exchanges are an important part of all of this. Visitors programs, there are, and having a much more active representation abroad by our cultural affairs officers who tend to be out there in the field, who interact with people other than in the ministries, who will talk to filmmakers and professors and authors and other cultural figures, religious leaders and so on, who somehow tend to be beyond the reach of most ordinary embassy officers. And many of these cultural affairs officers will have their finger on the pulse of foreign societies in ways that some of the political officers often do not have. But this is something that I would like to repeat is not emphasized at the department. Excellence in this business is not rewarded. It's not properly funded. We have a former ambassador on our board of trustees at the Institute of World Politics, Dr. Aldona Vosh, who was ambassador to Estonia, and I asked her, what would you like to have if you possibly could have in the realm of scholarships, Fulbright scholarships, and that sort of thing for Estonians to visit the United States? She had something like 30, and she said that she could easily use 200, but that's not something that U.S. foreign policy particularly cares about. And this gets down to a fundamental problem that diplomacy and public diplomacy almost never get funded according to national strategic need, which is why I recommend that somehow the Congress get itself together and create a unified defense and foreign policy budget, which where all diplomacy and public diplomacy are seen as part of the national security infrastructure of the United States, and they are much, much cheaper than other national defense spending, and they ought to be funded according to national strategic need. And when Haroon talks about about how we have to do more with less, this is a fundamental problem. It shouldn't have to happen when something has the kind of impact that our broadcasters have in the world. We should, the entire Voice of America, I remember when it was at its zenith in the Cold War, was the whole budget was the equivalent of 5 F-15 aircraft at a time when we were buying 900 F-15s. And this is what we're talking about. And so for our government to nickel and dime this function is reckless and irresponsible.
Yeah, just add to that, I couldn't agree more with what you said, Dr. Lenkowski. I think, Kissinger once said that there should be nothing foreign about foreign policy. And I think that sort of models what Dr. Fulner opened with today. I think there's a couple ways you can do that you can actually, having worked at state as a diplomat, there's programs like Diplomats in Residence. There's programs where you have people talk about their experiences abroad in local communities, wherever they're from. I'm from rural America. So I'm from a small town in Eastern Washington State. So I go back often to talk. That's my community. That's my and a lot of those folks, I go back and do a lot of things with the Rotary clubs, et cetera. So I think that's in a small way that helps. I'll just give an idea. This is not something necessarily that BBG would be involved in, but you also have to think about what are ways that we can make foreign policy accessible. So, for example, if you look at the new ways that young people are learning, in terms of MOOCs and things online courses, and now that we have machine learning and AI, we have Alexas and things like that. Wouldn't it be great if you could ask Alexa, what did President Reagan think about the Cold War? And in President Reagan's voice comes up, a speech that he gave, some of his iconic speeches. So my point is that there are ways to use technology that might help this with young people. They're not going to, I joke sometimes. When I wrote my book last fall, I was really ecstatic because I got on 2020 and I was on with Diane Sawyer talking about ISIS and it was on. And my parents were ecstatic, but a lot of my friends, I asked them, I said, I got on 2020, I'm on Diane Sawyer. They're like, who? I teach at Georgetown, and I asked my class, they're like, who's that again? unfortunately or fortunately, there's different mediums and ways that young people access content. They don't know the sort of the sort of Edward R. Murrows and the generation that we think of as sort of and so I think about also, in answering your question, we have to think about, which we excel in technology and thinking about how to make these things accessible. I think there's ways to do it, and somebody has to take charge of that.
Right. Anybody else have a question? Yes, there in the back.
Thank you. Katie Wang with NTD TV. Yeah, it's just reported that China will merge 3 government-run media and create this gigantic propaganda machine in the world and to improve its global image. So my question is, so for the new administration, Trump administration, do you think that they have a strategy to counter this kind of propaganda or infiltration by the Chinese government?
It's a very
Security strategy.
good question. We're going to have a second panel following this one, in which we will be talking about China more specifically, but certainly there is a sense here that we have a specific awareness of the Chinese challenge of the administration.
I think that, as I brought that example when I was talking about this idea that they just launched Voice of China, and I just think of it as sort of on this now when I think of information statecraft, how important it is that countries like the Russians are putting billions of dollars into this area. The Chinese are putting a lot of money into this area. So it's not just non-state actors like ISIS and the Taliban and Boko Haram, but it's now, and I think as General Mattis pointed out in the new defense strategy, you have now one of the big threats of these sort of transnational state actor-driven threats, and so you find that a lot of people are putting information resources. And I think just adds to what Dr. Lenkowski said, is that we have to, I think, as we want to double down on how important this is. Yes, we've had to do more with less. But there's other audiences we want to reach. There's content and distribution that we want to be at the tip of the spear. So we want to reach some of those key audiences, and we're hoping that the Chinese, as I talked about with reciprocity, that they allow our journalists in there the way that we allow the journalists here. They continue to block our content. We're not allowed on any of the cable channels, for example. So they make it very difficult every step of the way. Even if you had a colleague here that was visiting recently, and even if you Google certain news stories like the recent announcement of Xi Jinping, you can't find it oftentimes on via Chinese servers. It doesn't come up on any recent news. So it just shows how important our work is, because we're providing accurate fact-based reporting. I gave you the example of the Russian elections. No one was covering Alexander Navalny in terms of in the recent, who's the sort of one of the opposition leaders. No, you wouldn't find that anywhere on Russian media coverage, but you'd find it on Current Time. You'd find it on our around-the-clock coverage. So our strength, our competitive advantage is that we have a unique perspective of telling America's story and our storytellers and aligning, again, with the national security strategy.
May I just observe, Kitty, one of the things that we do only episodically in the U.S. government is actually track what foreign propaganda, disinformation, active measures, and these other kinds of activities are. When I came into the Reagan administration in 1981, the U.S. intelligence community was barely tracking any of this stuff. And fortunately, there were elements within the U.S. Information Agency and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Research, for example, that were tracking some of this kind of thing. But there was no systematic national strategic effort, and we had to change the national intelligence topics so that collection would happen on this. I am gathering now that there are people in the State Department, for example, who have been tasked, and this is a nice thing to see, that state has started to do it within the last year or two, to start analyzing some of these types of activities. Now, I think that they're mostly focusing on active measures, on covert political influence operations, something that the U.S. government neglected for a quarter of a century, ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I remember when the Ukrainians in 1994 started complaining about Russian active measures against them, and nobody in Washington paid any attention to this. They were doing it for 20 years before they sent in the little green men. The hybrid warfare has been going on for a very long time, and the U.S. government hasn't been paying attention. I think now that the Russians overstepped their bounds, and the Chinese are heavily, heavily involved, perhaps more subtly than the Russians, in influence operations in the United States and throughout the world.
Could I just raise a point about that? Because I think what Dr. Lenczewski raises is very valuable. But the element that has been charged with this collection of data is at the State Department. And I would just raise that if you look around the world at how other countries are starting to, and the Europeans have been dealing with Russian and active measures for much longer than, or on a different scale than we have until recently. And they approach it in a way that I think we could learn a lot of lessons from, which is, why would we want the State Department to be doing research on how a foreign government's active measures are impacting our domestic population? That to me seems like a domestic agency question. And so we keep talking about foreign government interference in the U.S. as though it's State Department's job to protect and defend and respond. And to be sure, the State Department should be in the room, and there should be discussions, there should be linked up. But fundamentally, I see that as something that should be handled by a domestic agency, whether it's FBI or DHS or some other agency should have the lead, because so much of it is in terms of response has to be on the domestic side. How do you inform the American public that the news they're getting is not accurate or reasonable? That's not State Department's job. And so I think when we, especially as the Trump administration starts to consider what is the institutional architecture that we need in place to be better protected or to respond more effectively, I would strongly urge them to think about and look at other models that exist. For example, the way the Czech government has set up in the last 18 months, a new government agency that deals with this. It's housed within their Ministry of the Interior, or whatever you'd consider their domestic law enforcement agency, which I think is an incredibly insightful way to think about this problem.
We have one final question for this panel, and then we'll adjourn and get a new group of speakers up here.
Hello, my name is Evgenia.
Oh, I'm sorry, we had a little, well, maybe we can combine these last two comments. There's one in the back as well. Sorry, you can't see what I'm seeing. Yes.
Hello, my name is Evgenia, and I'm from the Russian embassy. So my question actually is to Harun Ula. Earlier you told that Russia and ISIS use the same playbook. I'm just trying to understand the way you think, and I want to ask, what do you mean by saying that? Thank you.
Yes, and let's combine it with a question down.
Hi, I'm Gordon Johnson, businessman, retired. And thinking back to Vietnam, I'm wondering, the big question in Vietnam was, how are we doing with the minds of the people in the villages? And this is really the problem in public diplomacy. How do we know how we're doing with the minds? Because that's what wars are now. They're wars for minds rather than for geography. In Vietnam, there was a computer in Bangkok, a great big, and the level of majors went out into every village and asked questions to try to map the feelings of the Vietnam villagers. The major would ask questions like, when you go into a village, do the children run away or do the children come to greet you? They would ask, does a chief or the head of the village sleep in the village, or does he go to a neighboring village for safety? In other words, they were trying to measure the level of mind, what the mindsets were. And is somewhere in the US government, is there a map of how we're doing around the world? We have an economic freedom map from Heritage, but is there anybody doing maps of how are we doing? And it's critical questions in measure. What do you measure? But
Yeah, it's related to what we were just discussing before. Does anybody want to take it? Well, obviously, Harun, your comparison of Russia and ISIS.
Yes, absolutely. So I'd say in three ways. So one, and I've written about this. You can look at my book, as I mentioned, Digital World War, and I've written a lot about this. But one is that in terms of first mover advantage. So when they look at it, they understand the sort of information space that you want to define the narrative. You want everyone to be able to respond to. So in a lot of ways, ISIS, they'll put something out very quickly, whether it's take responsibility for a bombing or to sort of, the way they do their storyboarding is the same way that you find oftentimes some of the broadcasting outlets that are pushing sort of a Russian sponsored agenda. So that in terms of, again, setting the narrative, it reminds me of when oftentimes I was in London in a previous life and I met with one of the RT senior executives and I said, we were having a chat over coffee and I just said, well, what's the goal? Oftentimes your work. And he's like, well, it's to confuse people. Because we want them to understand there's no objective truth, right? The goal is not necessarily to move the needle all the way, it's just to sort of plant that seed. Two, I'd say computational tactics. So they use very similar computational tactics. I've mapped this out in terms of algorithms. But basically, they understand that you need a very nimble, fast-moving ecosystem of fanboys to sort of help amplify content and seed content, because that's how you get virality to move across platforms. And so there's a number of other ways I can talk to you about. I'm not trying to say there's collusion between the two, but what I'm trying to say is that they use similar tactics. It's just it's sort of something that Dr. Lankowski talked about, information operations. This is the same using current tools, and they use new platforms. So a lot of times we talk about Facebook and Twitter, but where are oftentimes a lot of the key audiences using? Does anyone know what the #1 app is now for ISIS? I guess. No, it's not Telegram. It's called Saraha. A lot of people don't know, right? So it's actually was started as an anti-bullying app, and you'll see channels now that RT are using on Saraha too. It's a way to reach young people. It was designed for a very different purpose, but now that's the way that young people are using it. So we're talking about older apps, so they use what I call platform agility.
Right. And do we have a map of how we're doing around the world?
Let me just observe that when we shifted our doctrine in the Afghan war, we were starting to pay attention more to, and in Iraq as well, we started paying attention to hearts and minds. And as it happens, General Mike Flynn, when he came in to head up military intelligence in Afghanistan, observed that we were collecting 95% of our collection effort was on improvised explosive device networks, and only 5% on cultural intelligence of what was going on in the valleys and the villages and the tribes and how they viewed us. He said that that ratio had to be exactly reversed in this type of a war, and he launched or at least made a major intensification of an effort which was called the Human Terrain Initiative, which meant mapping the human terrain and understanding what the attitudes were. But the U.S. government did not have an institutional capability to do this, and so they hired contracting companies that would hire people who had regional expertise and cultural anthropological knowledge and sensitivity to go and do these kinds of things. As it happens, a number of our graduates at the Institute of World Politics who've been educated in public diplomacy were hired by some of these firms in order to go do this, and they would do surveys of one of them, for example, who ended up finally getting the job as head of the Afghan desk in the Pentagon, launched on his own initiative a survey of the effectiveness of Al-Qaeda and Taliban propaganda in 6 strategic Afghan provinces, and found all sorts of very lamentable attitudes.
Well, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for your questions, and we will get up, stretch our legs maybe, and then get on to the second panel of the day. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And I should say, in the second half of the program, we'll focus more specifically on regional threats to U.S. national security from the public diplomacy perspective.
I'm trying. It's not easy on the inside. You can imagine a lot of those suspense.
I would love to, I'd love to be, I can't, you know, I am so sorry institute work that I can't even have a life of the mind anymore. But I would love to catch up.
No, I would love
with
to
you.
launch our coffee.
Yeah,
We're located out in Virginia, homework and stuff and all that. Otherwise, I would. But no, I haven't. I would love to be, whenever they can, the structure, so they have a CEO and an advisory board. I would love to be on that advisory board.
Yeah.
Was I wearing like? I was just well, it's Colorado.
I know, but you had like, did you have like a polo or something? Like, it was
No,
like,
no, no. I don't
Somebody
think
had
I-
a polo. I was
Hey,
like,
oh
that's-
yeah, you'll see that out there. Absolutely. No, I didn't have anything like that. Probably cowboy boots,
You did-
jeans, and a
yeah,
shirt.
yeah,
That was
sure,
it.
yeah.
But I don't wear a tie out there. But yeah, that's kind of. Do you guys know each other?
No.
No. Oh, you
Do
don't?
now.
Oh, okay,
Do
good. All right. Right. Around everybody else out. They shouldn't let them leave. Let them, leave. Now they got to get them back in. Yeah, some starting 3 o'clock-ish, maybe some turn to white stuff. I think things are gonna be closed tomorrow. I think tomorrow's gonna be closed. Yeah. Well, they're gonna get 6 to 10 west of here and north, so, but we're probably gonna be, I don't know.
I know my kids' school's gonna be closed.
Is that right?
Like, they close it when.
Well, this is their last chance to get to close the school, right?
Right.
Probably, right? And that
They're
could-
way over their days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's gonna screw up our summers.
Really? Where are you living?
In Montgomery County.
They've closed a lot more than.
They only get, because the weather tends to be fairly mild, they only get 2.
Oh,
They've done
right.
like 4 or 5 already.
Oh, right, yeah. Loudoun County actually gets extra time each day. So they have more days, and then if they don't use them, the teachers don't get the time off, they don't graduate early or anything, so people get really grumpy. So in other words, they're putting in, doing like a, I don't know, an 8-hour day instead of a 6-hour day, and then, so they, in case they need the extra days, and this year it was very dry, so they didn't need them. No. I live in Fairfax, but I know some people out that way. Know some teachers out that way. So, but if you're coming in from Loudoun, yeah, Fairfax is bad enough. No. I'm in Fairfax. So I'm down south of the city. So I take 95, but I've got I've got an 8th grader or 2nd grader in St. Peter's over here in Cowside. So my wife works carpooling every morning. It isn't actually bad in like about a half hour.
Really?
Well, you take the HOV lanes. Yeah, HOV lanes. Otherwise, it
You
would
don't
be.
pay the $30 one way or whatever.
No, because we have 3 people. So we drop him off, she drops me off, then she parks at Cato, and we do the reverse at night.
Terrific.
Yeah, it works. I mean, it's like 30, 35 minutes. And of course, there's always a possibility of a problem, but generally it's only 30 for about 20 miles. It's pretty good. So.
20 miles and it's looking at hard.
Is that
Hour
right?
15,
Yeah, is no good public transportation for you?
No, actually, it's the same because I have to drive to take the metro and I live
Okay.
here.
Oh, okay, right.
And I'm a control freak.
I do, yeah, pretty much, unless I'm traveling or something like that.
I work. FaceTime is good, right, in general. And I have lots of meetings, but I keep swinging. It's one day a week.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna start doing what the Heritage folks do, which is to start staggering my schedule, which is, a lot of us, like coming a little bit later, and they're not buffered by
Oh, yeah, I
rush
don't
hour,
think,
so, yeah.
yeah. I think we have a lot of flexibility. Are you ready? Hannah? Are you sure? Do you want to get that door? Should I get that door? I don't know. Oh, okay. All right, we're going to get started with the next panel, Influence Space, the Challenges from Abroad. Joining us today is Elon Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. At AFPC, Elon focuses on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. Elon is also an adjunct professor for international law and global security at the National Defense University and a member of the associated faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. That's quite a business card. He's also advised the Department of Defense, the CIA, and congressional offices on foreign policy and national security. He's the author of a number of books, the most recent being Winning the Long War, Retaking the Offensive Against Radical Islam. Is that the latest?
No, it's not the latest.
It's not?
But it's the
What's
most
your
it's
latest?
the
Tell
most
us.
The most germane.
I got
for
this
the-
from
for
Hella,
this.
so
Yeah,
what's the latest book?
Latest book is called Iran's Deadly Ambition.
Okay, there you got it. Corrected for the record.
That's all right.
Elon has a BA in politics from Brandeis and an MA in international politics from American University and JD from Washington College of Law. Elon will be speaking about the Middle East, right?
Yep.
Okay. We also have here Mark Stokes, who is the executive director of the Project 2049 Institute. Previously, he was a founder and president of Quantum Pacific Enterprises, an international consulting firm, and vice president and Taiwan country manager for Raytheon International. He also served as executive vice president of Lifehu Trading Company, a subsidiary of Rayfeld Group, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and a member of the board of governors of the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan. A 20-year U.S. Air Force veteran, Mark also served as team chief and senior country director for the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He holds a BA from Texas A&M University and graduate degrees in International Relations and Asian Studies from Boston University and a Naval Postgraduate School. He has a working proficiency in Chinese, and Mark will be talking about China. And Hella Dale, Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy at the Heritage Foundation. I understand Hella was introduced previously on an earlier panel.
Yes.
Okay, and she'll be talking about Russia. Who should we start with, Hella?
Well, why don't we start with Elon?
Elon. Okay, Elon.
Okay.
Care to start? Thank you.
There.
Wherever you like, whichever you're comfortable
Well,
with.
let me sit. If you guys don't mind, I'll be a little bit less formal. I'll sit here. 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Okay. I'll try to be as coherent and as short as I can. It's not always the same thing. So, first of all, thank you. This is, I think, an enormously important topic at a very, very opportune time. As all of you know, if you're working in this space, there's been a tremendous amount of turmoil, even in the last week, in terms of personnel, right? I'm a firm believer that personnel is policy, so we'll sort of get to that point when we talk about it. But my writ today is to talk about the Middle East, or maybe scoped a little bit differently, to talk about the war of ideas and the war on terror, right? So that component of what we've been looking at in the Middle East and elsewhere over the last 2 decades. Because it has been almost 2 decades. And for almost 2 decades, we've struggled with 2 competing notions. One is the reality which is being conveyed to us by military commanders, by every military commander, every civilian person in the civilian command authority has come to the realization that we can't kill our way out of this problem. That we're looking at kinetic conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, low-level engagements in places like the Sahel and in Southeast Asia. But the reality is the real battle is being waged in terms of hearts and minds, in a very real sense. You can erode the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, but do nothing to dent its mystique. And that's a completely different target set, and it's a completely different battle, and it's one where we have to use information rather than bullets. And we've been struggling with the best approach to figure out how to do this, the best mousetrap for the war of ideas for almost 2 decades. In the early going, the Bush administration really focused on this idea of demystifying and selling America, right? This was the whole brand America concept, the idea that if they know us, they'll love us. It turned out not so much. So I don't want to spend a lot of time in it. We can certainly do it in the question and answers. But there was a lot of naturally characterized as false starts that the Bush administration tried in terms of trying to capture the intellectual space in the war of ideas in its 2 terms in office. The Obama administration had a different problem. They essentially had, during its 2 terms in office, the Obama administration had a fundamental misreading of the Muslim world, and it had a retraction of U.S. foreign policy. And those 2 things combined together in a very sort of pernicious environment for U.S. influence and U.S. information abroad. In terms of misreading the Muslim world, President Obama's maiden foreign policy outing in mid-2009, this was the sort of uncharitably called his apology tour to the Muslim world. The capstone of that tour was his speech at Al-Azhar University in Egypt, in which he essentially told the 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, you're all the same. You have a problem with America. We have a problem with you. Let's all work to make it better, right? Even the title of the speech was A New Beginning, right? And so as an interesting thought exercise in the almost decade since, every time I go to a majority Muslim country, I try to ask the same question, which is, what did you think of President Obama's Al-Azhar address? And, when you go to places as diverse as Uzbekistan or Morocco or Turkey, you would imagine that you would get different answers to that question. But the answer that I get is uniformly the same. He wasn't talking about us, right? Which is, I think, a really interesting commentary on the idea that you can actually overgeneralize so it's not helpful. So when President Obama talked about the Muslim world as an undifferentiated mass of 1.7 billion people, he sort of lost any ability to nuance, to essentially divide and conquer. He instead agglomerated the Muslim masses into one undifferentiated mass, and it made it much more difficult for us to communicate with them, because Muslims in Indonesia want different things than Muslims in Indiana, right? And this became something that was really lost. And at the same time, the Obama administration was pursuing a foreign policy that was built around a lighter footprint, a sort of a right sizing of America's role in the Middle East. And this had not only a material effect, not only a physical effect, but it also had an effect of removing the U.S. from the intellectual space and creating a permissive environment where other forces, whether state-run forces like Russia, Russia's media outlets, China's media outlets, or extremist forces like the propaganda being espoused by the Islamic State, had a fertile environment, right? It's sort of an uncontested space in which to move around. So this is the environment that the Trump administration encountered when it took office. On January 20th of last year, when President Trump took office, he was essentially looking at three major tools in his arsenal in the battle of ideas. He was looking at the Middle East broadcasting networks, right? So for those of you that know this, this is Al Hurra, which is the television, Arab language television channel run by the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and Radio Sawa, which is its radio analog. And this targeted a very small segment of that larger Muslim world. It targeted the Arab-speaking Sunni Muslims of the Middle East, which is a cohort of about 400 million people, which is large, but not so large when you realize that over 1 billion Muslims live in 4 countries, just 4 countries in Asia, right? So you're essentially sort of scoping down your outreach, and you're just focusing on the Middle East because that's sort of where the action is, and that's sort of what you're doing. He also had a outreach to Iran, right? And Haroon, who's a good friend, talked about that earlier. But that outreach under Obama had migrated from outreach to Iran writ large to outreach just to the Iranian government, right? Because it is very gauche to try to undermine and negotiate with the same actor at the same time. And so progressively, during the course of the Obama administration, as we moved closer and closer to what the administration envisioned as détente with Iran in the form of the Iran nuclear deal, there was less and less emphasis placed on engaging with the Iranian people and more emphasis placed on engaging with the government. And our broadcasting reflected this. And as Haroon mentioned, my institute, the American Foreign Policy Council, did a study, a big study at the request of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, looking at content in Persian media. And what we actually discovered was sort of fit very much in that trend line, which is that journalism was very bare bones when it came to Iran. It was really sort of just the facts. There was no context. It was really de minimis journalism because under the prevailing political environment, that was sort of all that was called for. And the third element, the third sort of moving part in what Trump had at his disposal last year was something known as the GEC, the Global Engagement Center. This is the counter, at that time, the shop, the element of the State Department that was tasked with doing counter-ideology against the Islamic State. Before that, it had been sort of known as the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. It was a sort of a very nominally funded State Department shop. It was an initiative of the State Department, but you wouldn't say it wasn't a full-throated initiative on the part of the State Department. So you fast forward a year to where we are now, and very little has changed, with the exception of the GEC budget, which received modest increases under the tenure of Secretary Tillerson and received significant increases from the outside because the GEC had an expansion of its mandate and of its budget as a result of the Countering America's Adversaries Act, which Congress passed against Russia, North Korea, and Iran cumulatively last summer, which increased its budget by an order of magnitude, but it also made the GEC into something resembling a Swiss Army knife. If the focus of the GEC before Congress acted was to counter ISIS propaganda, and you could say that that aperture was too small, now the aperture is too large. The aperture is you must counter both state and non-state-based
information operations, right? So the GEC now becomes the tip of the spear in dealing not only with ISIS, but also dealing with Iran, with Qatar, with Russia, with China, Turkey, right? So the list sort of goes on. And this is always this is where the zone of danger when you talk about government institutions that are sort of repurposed to do things that they're not supposed to do, right? So this is essentially where we are now in the present day. And it leaves us with what I would argue are three sort of large questions. Where is the action is the first one. And so here the rule, the analogy I always like to use is that of the bank robber Willie Sutton. Right? So for those of you that know your American history, in the 1920s and 1930s, Willie Sutton was an enormously successful bank robber who sort of ran this series of capers throughout the American Midwest. When the FBI finally caught up to him and asked him, why do you rob all these banks? He said, well, it's because that's where all the money is, right? So applying that paradigm, the Willie Sutton paradigm is that the action is increasingly digital. And so what you're looking at is, and you know, from Haroon's comments, it's sort of, I think, very heartening that you have somebody sort of younger generationally who sort of understands the importance of social media and of the digital space. But this is a domain where we are late in the game. ISIS, not only ISIS, but Iran, Russia, enormously sophisticated on social media platforms, ranging from Twitter to Telegram to Facebook, including other sort of lesser known ones that help it to organize, help them to propagate their messages. We are not heavily leveraged in that space. This is beginning to change, as you heard from Haroon, but we are late in the game. We're essentially playing catch up, and this is a real problem. The second sort of large question is, what are our objectives? And this is not a peripheral problem. This is a central question, because the president has articulated a very clear vision with regard to the defeat of the Islamic State in places like Iraq and Syria. What he hasn't said yet is whether or not he's prepared to follow the Islamic State as it migrates to other theaters like North Africa or Southeast Asia, or whether or not he's willing to challenge them robustly in the digital domain or elsewhere. And that will shape everything with regard to our public diplomacy and whether our public diplomacy outreach is capitalized. The same holds true with regard to Iran. Under Obama, outreach to the Iranian people specifically was chronically underserved. This is beginning to change, and you saw this change in a very positive fashion during the recent unrest in Iran, where you did have top-level government engagement, where people like General McMaster would show up on the airwaves. But this has to be a sustained effort. It's not sufficient to just say, you're having a revolution, potentially, maybe we should say something about it. It's necessary to communicate with them and to show that the administration is engaged consistently over time. And determining these things will help shape the nature of sort of what we want to do, what we want to accomplish in that space. And the last question that we have is, are we postured properly to accomplish these goals? Here, the question of BBG reform, which we heard a lot about in the last panel, is crucial. BBG reform is something resembling a pedestrian caught in mid-stride at the moment, because we have a BBG reform bill and a comprehensive package, but we don't have a timeline for when those reforms will kick in. Because charitably, information operations rank very low on the pecking order, sort of in the food cycle of the State Department and of the government writ large. We also don't have, in those disparate parts, communicating with the Sunnis, communicating with the Iranians, communicating with everybody else, we also don't have sufficient interconnectivity between agencies, right? There's no such thing as a fusion center that slaves U.S. counterterrorism policy with our messaging towards the Iranians, right? And we need to begin to think about how that works. We need to begin to think about where public diplomacy fits in the larger sort of warfighting domain. And lastly, or almost lastly, personnel is policy. So there's a chronic lack of staffing and top-level attention. The slot of Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs was vacant for 11 months until Steve Goldstein's appointment through the auspices of, through the recommendation of the Secretary of State at the time, Rex Tillerson, in December. He was fired 3 months into his tenure. And now we have Heather Nauert, the former State Department spokesperson, who's I think likely to ascend. But it is fair to say that this is a post that has been chronically over the last decade vacant more than it's been filled. And even when it's been filled, its duties haven't been clear, right? So clarifying that mission, clarifying what money you have, clarifying what you're going to do with it becomes enormously important. And finally, I would point out the mission, right? So the mission drives. On the third floor of the Voice of America building on Constitution Avenue, it's where the suite of offices where the Broadcasting Board of Governors have where John Lansing, the BBG CEO, sits, where all their staff work. On the wall, it says, it has in nice raised letters, the BBG motto, which is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. And it's really interestingly tiered. In support of freedom and democracy is a second line, right, on the wall. And that's a really good analogy for how the BBG these days thinks about what it's doing. Because in practice, and this is some of the work that Harun is doing in terms of trying to unwind this, that second line is silent. We are focusing much more on the objective journalism part, far less on the fact that we have to nestle it in a context of promoting American ideas, promoting democratic values, right? That should be the lead, but we're burying the lead. And so as the Trump administration begins to move into this space where it thinks about, sort of holistically about how to think about the war of ideas, those are sort of the ideas that I would offer. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Also to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me to address one of my favorite topics. I would add it's an honor and a pleasure to see Peter again, who was my boss in the Pentagon for a while. Quite been many years, but good to see you. This topic I'm going to be talking about is Chinese Communist Party influence operations in the United States. It's difficult. It's a difficult issue. It's gained a lot of media recently, at least over the last 6 months or so. But I'm here to tell you that it's not new. It's been around for quite a while, and it's a difficult topic for a number of reasons. First, to get a sense of the scope of the issue, defining the problem, defining the actors, and trying to also define exactly what to do about it can be difficult. I began to develop some interest in this topic after I retired from the Air Force and from government service and working within the Office of Secretary of Defense, managing our relations with the People's Liberation Army in China, as well as our relationship with Taiwan. Spent a few years in Taiwan defense industry. Figured out that really wasn't for me in the private sector, so came back and established a think tank in early 2008. It was shortly after that I got an email from an old friend in Taiwan who said I'd been slimed in a outlet associated with Renmin Erbao out of Beijing, one of the party media outlets. And some of the article, looked it up, and the head of it was using my name in Chinese, that I've been an arms dealer, made a lot of money by beating the war drums, playing up the China threat, and then bought a really big a mansion out in Manassas because I've made so many profits, and then made a linkage at the time to a working group going on Taiwan policy, sort of study group that was affiliated with Dan Blumenthal, who also had been OSD, and also Randy Shriver, who also had been in OSD and is now back in DoD. But it was interesting because the angle of this, I looked at it and it didn't get nuts. I didn't take it personally, and a friend in Taiwan said, well, you shouldn't take it personally because it's not really directed at you, and then began to outline sort of some of the sophisticated aspects of it. First of all, the use of what's called internet search optimization, where you had, there were keywords that were in there. It was a pretty sophisticated approach. It wasn't necessarily directed against me. It was more directed against this policy working group, meaning Dan and Randy, but even more particular, the target audience was on Taiwan, to be able to create the perception that those who had traditionally supported U.S. interests in Taiwan weren't doing it because of any sort of principled approach, but because just to make money, and that was sort of the signal they were trying to get across. That was followed up then by some other other events, including an editorial written by a retired vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retired admiral, who also wrote an editorial that was that broke a taboo in terms of calling for a review of the Taiwan Relations Act. And that was interesting because it was unheard of. And so what would drive an individual of this prominence and who had gone into business to do this? And the first reaction had just business to want to make money, and which was interesting. But he was part of a dialogue that became known as the Sanya talks, which is a group of retired 4-stars on the U.S. side, Army, Navy, Air Force, to engage in a dialogue with a generic sounding organization called the China Association for International Friendly Contact, or CAFIC for short, which doesn't really sound like very much, but then began interest in exactly what CAFIC is, and so began to do research, and have been doing this research now for about 10 years. And expanded a bit. As it turns out, CAFIC was an affiliate of the PLA General Political Department, specifically something called the General Political Department Liaison Department. And this gets into sort of the theme of my presentation, which is sort of trying to get at, in terms of influence operations, where did it begin and who influenced it, and where does it stand today? In terms of China's approach to influence operations in the U.S., there are generally going to be three, at least, sort of guiding philosophies behind it. Of course, you have traditional Chinese culture, for example, the 36 strategies and Sun Tzu and things like that. But I'm not so sure if this is as significant as others. There's a generic set of themes or principles that were outlined in Germany in the 1930s by Goebbels, propaganda minister, under Nazi Germany, that laid out some fundamental principles. For example, centralization of basically to be able to guide throughout the bureaucracy, and also the principle of corporatism, where you can ally with those that aren't necessarily in government, but, for example, in businesses for common interests. The importance and the centrality of intelligence. You need to know who to target, what messages to present, and also develop measures of effectiveness. But perhaps even more important, though, would be some fundamental writings of Lenin in terms of agitation and propaganda, bearing in mind that during the early days of the Chinese Communist Party, there was a very close relationship with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In fact, membership in Comintern and education within educational institutions in terms of party building within Moscow. The PLA was, from the very start, was at the center of this, particularly the PLA, the General Political Department. A disciplined approach to what was called enemy work was developed and established in terms of organization in 1937. This was part of three branches of underground work. In enemy work, which is targeted against, at the time, would have been the KMT, the central government of China at the time, as well as the Japanese who were occupying forces in China. Then you also had what's called the urban work, which was to be able to develop memberships within, of course, the urban elite, Shanghai and other places in China. But these are examples, some of the branches of underground work that form the roots of what today is various parts of the system in China today. Eventually, when you look at Chinese influence operations, it's useful to look at it as a system of systems approach. Starting off with, there are three basic systems in communist China today. They would include the party, the state, and then, of course, the military. Within this, systems engaged in influence operations include the external affairs system. It includes the propaganda ideology system. It includes the United Front Work system. You have a military system that is in and of itself. And then you also have what has emerged as sort of an economic and finance system as part of it. The various themes that are presented in terms of influence operations in the U.S., there are things that do seem to adopt at least some of the themes that the Soviets used in their active measures. Let's say, for example, the de-ideologicalization of state-to-state relations. De-ideologization means trying to present the idea that it's not a competition of ideals, it's not a competition of principles, it's not liberal democracy versus authoritarian rule, that they're just like us. And so therefore, you put the state in front. The idea that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in the lead, and then playing down the idea that the Central International Department or Central International Liaison Department is not necessarily in the lead. But trying to present that they're just like us. Quite happy with the notions of Huntington, for example, Clash of Civilizations. They're quite happy with that kind of competition, or even a military competition. Playing up the idea of a new type of great power relationship is something that's better than having the notion of ideals driving policy and the competition between ideals and political systems. Within these systems, in terms of influence, trying to define influence operations is another challenge. And I guess one way to, all states and all governments try to influence the policies of others. But as a matter of statecraft, China the People's Republic of China, to be more specific, is going to be a bit different in terms of what John Garneau from Australia has called the 3 Cs, in that covert, there's a corrupting element, both in terms of legally corrupting, and then coercive in terms of what makes it a bit different. But there's a whole series in the U.S., there's a whole group of, you have the state-to-state part of it, the party-to-party part of it, and then you have the people-to-people part of it, or people's diplomacy. The people's diplomacy is one of the most underestimated instruments of influence operations. And there's a whole host of associations that exist that are active in the U.S. today. I'd mentioned the China Association for International Foreign Contact is one. And it's a platform. In the Soviet days, they called the organizations fronts. I think a more appropriate term in the Chinese context would be just a platform that's used by different parts of these systems that I mentioned before, different parts of the bureaucracy. But within the external affairs, they have one particular organization that's active. Anytime you see sort of friendship associations, and there's quite a few in the U.S. that exist. Within the United Front system, very active in the U.S., primarily through what's called a Council for Promotion of National Reunification, and then chapters in the U.S. You have a national chapter, regional chapters, and then a chapter in most of your major cities in the U.S., New York City, Washington, D.C., the newest one being in southern Florida. Then within the United Front system, there's, I guess, a total of maybe 30-some-odd organizations. Primary target, of course, are going to be your overseas Chinese. And part of the principle in terms of propagating an ideal, the idea that when you say the word China, that you're, I think one of the goals is try to conflate China with the Chinese Communist Party, is that the Chinese Communist Party is the only representative of China in the international community in the United States as a whole. In the U.S., it's a little bit different, more difficult target than it would be in other countries. There is a significant dissident population who would self-identify as being Chinese, but certainly not self-identifying as accepting the authority of the Chinese Communist Party in the U.S. But with Chinese being one of the fastest growing minorities in the U.S., there's an explicit effort to try to, at least from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective of these associations, trying to be able to infiltrate and to be able to influence, mobilize a lot for political purposes, with limited amounts of success, again, due to differing views of defining themselves as Chinese, whether you have Republic of China or Taiwan identify as that type of Chinese, certainly not sympathetic with the Chinese Communist Party. But then other systems, the propaganda ideology system, Confucius Institutes are probably the most well-known in the U.S., with the goal of Confucius Institutes being more broad in the sense of trying to condition at least younger people and within universities also condition not by what is said but what is not said. For example, trying to ensure that topics like Tibet or Xinjiang and most importantly Taiwan generally are kept out. within the military system, we have a robust, or have had a robust military-to-military relationship with China. But among, if you're a retired 4-star, or a retired senator who served on the, let's say, Senate Armed Service Committee or others, and then if you go into business, sooner or later, you probably were going to be hearing from somebody with an affiliation from, for example, in the past, it's been the China Association of National Friendly Contact, but one of these sorts of organizations, to be able to, understanding that informal social networks are important. But sort of to wrap it up, it's a significant issue. I'm not sure if we've really even cracked the surface in trying to get a handle on this aspect of Chinese statecraft. There's still a lot more work to do in trying to define the problem in better terms. Some are fairly obvious. Let's say, for example, you had the arrest in November of last year by an individual who was affiliated with something called the China Energy Fund Committee up in New York City under charges of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, of bribing the United Nations General Assembly President. And that was a fairly significant act. But that's an example of, in terms of influence operations, in this case within the United Nations context, going across the line in terms of alleged corruption. But there are also cases of coercion. In a study I did in 2013, I personally was legally threatened by that same organization that the individual up in New York was affiliated with. I'm not the only one, because there's been cases of coercive threats against a whole range of individuals in the U.S., Taiwan, and elsewhere in the world. And covert, of course, is standard as part in terms of an approach. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Ella?
Yes, thanks very much. So I'm going to be saying a few words about the Russian influence operations, something that we discussed in some detail in the previous panel. And obviously, there's a good reason why Russia has been on the minds of so many of us, given the central part Russia came to play, or tried to play, in the last presidential election. Those of us who have followed propaganda and the study of influence operations over the years were a little surprised, perhaps, that this came as such news to everybody here in Washington and in the media, that Russia was trying to influence our politics and the minds and hearts of Americans, and more specifically, actually, audiences abroad. Some 8 years ago, we published a study here at the Heritage Foundation called Russian Anti-Americanism, a Priority Target for U.S. Public Diplomacy. And I had this distinct sense of deja vu, because I sat here with one of my colleagues talking about that a long time ago. We have followed that subject and its Russian propaganda's influence throughout Europe for many years. Only this time, it seemed that Russia kind of hit a bullseye with its the feelers it sent into the U.S. electoral map. In addition to that, we've then had the case of the poisoning of the Russian spy and his daughter in Britain. A case that has now caused a huge uproar between the UK and Russia. Again, it's shocking, but nothing new. If you look back again almost a decade, they poisoned another Russian in London. That time it was with plutonium. So Russia is up to its old games. But we have, when we're looking at what we're up against some very sinister moves, obviously. We're up against something like the advances on Facebook with the purchase of Russian ads on Facebook, the attempt to arrange outcomes or contradictory outcomes sometimes in the Russia and in the U.S. presidential election. Some of it very clumsy, some of it very well articulated, but it is clear that in the last several years, the challenge from Russia has intensified, even if we recognize the nature of it as going back 10 years, back to the Cold War, even back to the days of Stalin and Lenin. The theme of trying to challenge the United States and the democratic systems throughout the world is consistent in Russian influence operations. A recent report by CPAC underlined these themes, and I highly recommend you to go back and take a look at that. The strategic goal from the Russian perspective is, first of all, in sort of a more immediate sense, to reestablish some of the parameters of the Soviet Union, moving into Ukraine, moving into Georgia, looking at Moldova or the Baltic countries as physical targets of annexation to some degree. But it is also to undermine the countries and the publics of Europe in their view of the United States as a reliable ally. As we recently experienced, undermine here the faith of Americans in their own system, in their own political system. And the Russians, if that was their purpose, darn well nearly succeeded, in part because the election result was such that the candidate who lost refused to accept why she lost and pointed to Russia as one of the key operative elements in the election, and that then has become a theme for American politics ever since. I'm sure in the Kremlin they have they must have thought that they hit a bullseye without really knowing how they did it. The intensity of the tools we face is something else. We have the Russians are using the internet expertly with their troll farms, with their targeting of individuals, like you were targeted by the Chinese. Anyone who stands up against Russian propaganda or Russian organs feels their heat if they want to check their Twitter account in the morning or one of all the social media accounts, they will be attacked immediately. The confusion and the kind of undermining that the Russians have succeeded in, I feel that is something that we need to tackle in a very serious manner. And as Ilan noted, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department is at the moment one of our few tools in that endeavor. They recently, back just a few weeks ago, launched a new initiative by which I believe they will contract with private organizations to come up with ideas for how to counter Russia's influence operations. I don't know how far they'll go, but at least it has an institutional home within the State Department. Again, in terms of our broadcasters, as we talked about in the previous session, we unfortunately abdicated our broad presence on the airwaves in Russia over 10 years ago, and have now just with the current time program started to challenge that again. But that is something that had to be revamped, re-upped after the invasion of Ukraine. So there was a lot of catching up to do there, and in many cases the internet, when you are looking at Russia, is not a very reliable tool, because it's easy, or certainly it's a target of governments like Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, whoever wants to suppress the ability of their publics for independent information. So Russia is one of the chief opponents out there that we need to focus on. China is another one. The terrorist organizations, Iran. It is a very diversified and wide field that we have to come to grips with, and we're hoping that with this program that will catch the attention of people engaged in the subject and those who should be more engaged than they have been. So with that, I'll stop here and see if anybody has some questions for us.
If you have a question, raise your hand. If you'd identify yourself, give your name and identify yourself for the courtesy to our speakers. You answered. You guys, okay, over here.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, actually, I saw, I mean, Chenwei China Daily, I just thought, I mean, my question, I mean, to the first panel actually was not really answered. You know, I just thought, you know, it's a blessing actually for American to get so diverse information. I mean, it's easy to dismiss, I mean, all the Chinese journalists, media, or Russian as propaganda. And you know, I can point a finger at the US media if you give me 30 minutes. You know, that's not helpful. I think, you know, the helpful things to, you know, the fact that, you know, my newspaper, China Daily, is read. I mean, if you go to Brookings, Peterson, CSI, all the China scholar, I know maybe the Heritage Foundation China scholar too, read China Daily. So, which means they find information useful. You know, I have friends working for Wall Street Journal in China. They all read China Daily, New York Times in China. So, which means you don't have to agree with them. You know, that's helpful thing you should, you know, welcome as my question, you know, said in the first panel. So, but, you know, why, I mean, you are so misinformed if you just, I said, watch one channel in America, you know, or watch, you know, only American channel. I don't know you try that. I mean, this is obviously when you see Fox News fighting MSNBC or MSNBC CNN fighting Fox News. So I think there's a similarity actually between this, you know, when the American media try to fight, I mean, Chinese or Russian as propaganda, or, you know, Fox News is saying, you know, MSNBC or CNN is propaganda, fake news. So I don't know. I mean, could we, I mean, turn more sort of positive attitude toward this sort of foreign media, even you think you disagree? I mean, I don't maybe agree with, I mean, I'll always disagree maybe, but you know, it's helpful just to be there and listen to what you disagree.
Does anybody want to take that?
Was there a question?
There was a comment.
Anybody wish to respond?
Yeah. So I actually, right, this is out of my space, right? But this is actually, I think it raises a very interesting conversation that we haven't really had here yet, which is what is the proper role for government and what is the improper role for government in terms of sort of wading into this space. Part of the sort of the inherent danger that I see from government outlets, including China Daily, is that it's not correct to say that RT cares equally about everything, right? There are certain things they don't care about. It's not the same thing. The same thing can be said for Al Jazeera. The same thing can be said for CCTV, right? They don't care. Well, not quite. But I do think the inherent danger for the American media consumer, right? Because that's really who we're talking about. For the American media consumer that's approaching these outlets is they don't exactly know where objective reporting ends and state interests begin. And that's why there is a compelling case to be made that the U.S. government has a legitimate role in terms of at least flagging these outlets in order to communicate to the American consumer that there is an agenda, right? By the way, right, this is not prohibiting. RT is required to register as a foreign agent, but they are not blocked from broadcasting in the United States. You can still access, their partner, sort of the website partner organization, which is Sputnik, right? You can go on RT.com. But it is a signal from the U.S. government, not to Russia, not to China, but to the American people that caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware, right? This is where it's coming from. This is the outlet. They may have certain opinions. Keep that in the back of your mind as you ingest this information. And frankly, that I find a completely legitimate form of government intervention in the sense that there's an overwhelming government interest to keep the media space open and to, as much as it can, to sort of eliminate that noise.
On the
We'll get you. We're gonna let him comment on this.
I don't know that much about China Daily. My understanding is that it has registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which implies a connection with the propaganda system within China. Propaganda system, that being a neutral term, it's just under some sort of, at least some direction of the Central Propaganda Department, or in terms of an organ in Beijing. The propaganda system in China, I mean, I read, for example, the People's Liberation Army Daily, and that's, I don't think it's any secret that it's a product of the PLA propaganda department, and same thing for the Navy and Air Force and military. So the main difference between that system and the U.S. system, it's hard to believe that New York Times or Wall Street Journal would be responding to general guidance from the U.S. government. Matter of fact, they're
Not at the moment.
very, 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 very different. So I'm not sure if I understand the comment or the question, but it's fairly well documented. There are some publications in China, I think, that are a little bit less connected. But I would ask you the question, I mean, what is China Daily's relationship with the propaganda system within China?
You know, it's very interesting. You know, the panels, the first panel talks so much about, I mean, how powerful a weapon this is. And then, you know, someone, I mean, I think from the board said, you know, we're great at telling American story. I mean, I come here to tell the Chinese story because from the Chinese perspective, you know, that's what I mentioned. When the panel talk about China and there is no Chinese here, you know, it's ridiculous. Not because you have to agree with them, because, you know, they have, their perspective should be considered. And that's sort of, I thought, the beauty of democracy, what, you know, you guys talk about all the time. Freedom of, you know, press, information. So, and now you're basically saying, let's talk our story. You guys shut up, you know, if you are from China or Russia. So, you know, you mentioned RT, it's very interesting. I watch RT, France 24, Turkish radio, I mean television, but you know, RT just disappeared from my RCN cable, I don't know, a month ago. So under, I believe, I don't know, I have no evidence, I saw this American pressure campaign now. I mean, so sort of a smear campaign about anything Russia. I mean, this is ridiculous. I'm not on the Donald Trump side, I'm not on any other side. I mean, if you watch American cable, the only thing you get, Russian collusion, Mueller, anything else. I mean, talk about the drone strike. Anytime you really reported the civilians are being killed by drone strike, by cable news, how much news you get about Afghanistan, Iraq, which American has the most involvement. You actually get more of the news from CGTN, CCTV, or France 24, you know, even NHK. So I just thought, you know, it's so much more helpful if you let international media come here, present their views. You don't have to agree with them. I watch Fox and watch MSNBC. I don't agree with everyone they say.
But you know, we do allow foreign media to come here.
No, I
and
just
present
said
their-
RT just disappeared from my
Well, then you need to
RCN.
call your cable provider and ask them why.
Yeah, that's because, you know, all this.
Sir, let's move on to some other questions here. Thank you very much for your views, and we can maybe come back to this, but we have some other people with questions. Here, take the microphone, please. So, because the online listeners will be able to hear you better.
My name is John Radman, and I'm a Heritage member. And the question that I have is why, you know, the restriction that China imposes on, you know, U.S. journalists and other countries' journalists, it's not, you know, and U.S. is allowing all of these agencies and news forms, you know, from China. Why don't we restrict it, or why isn't there reciprocity between the two? And say, okay, if you guys are going to be allowing journalism, U.S. journalists over there to report what's going on over there, then we are going to allow your journalists or agencies to, you know, to do the same thing. Why don't we restrict that?
Anybody want to take that question?
Just a quick answer. I mean, it has, I think the basic reason is that within China, you have the Chinese Communist Party. It is an authoritarian, autocratic system, and they don't. They're going to have significant restrictions. In the U.S., there should be freedom in the media, and But in terms of the question of reciprocity, is a good one and should be addressed.
But also, I mean, they have been asked to register under the foreign, so the foreign agent.
They're trying to undermine this country, okay, with their propaganda, right? So isn't there some law that kind of prohibits them from operating, you know, in the United States if they're trying to do that? It seems like, you know, it's wide open for them to, you know, to sell their propaganda. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet, you can't have journalists in China reporting on what's going on over there. Why are we so open to that? I mean, it's almost treasonous. It's almost treasonous to allow that. That's what I don't understand.
It's one of the disadvantages of living in an open democratic.
It's open for free press, but it's not open for propaganda and going almost close to treason is what they're trying to do with respect to the propaganda and undermine this country. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question here? Does anybody else have any response to that? Additional response? Okay.
My question is for Dr. Berman. I'm going to take you back down memory lane, somewhere around April 2008, when Barack Obama was the candidate. And he was endorsed by Senator Edward Kennedy. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was where the endorsement was. It was at the American University. And I attended American University in the 80s, and I knew at the time I was there, it was 65% foreign enrollment. And I used to watch the Saudis land their helicopter on the quad. It's clear that Obama had a hidden agenda. We call it apologetic approach. That wasn't it. That wasn't it at all. He has an agenda, and what I think it is, and it's just my theory, just looking at everything, what Obama wants is he wants the whole world to rule, but open bisexual leaders. He wants it to be open. He don't want to be closed. And if he can do that worldwide, it's successful. So, but folks like Russia, it's not going to allow that, because Russia just waiting to take it over. If we take this country and put it to an openly bisexual leadership, it's gone. We need masculinity. We need men. Ain't no ifs and buts about it.
Do you have a public diplomacy question?
Well, yeah, I did.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
The question was, how do we rectify the cultural war that Obama enticed in the Islamic community? Because that's what he did. That's why we, sent him his rose.
So I think that's a serious question, which is insofar as the United States appears to be promoting values that are anathematic to Muslim society, it downgrades, at the very least, it downgrades sort of the appeal of the American message. I would say that a good place to start is to not send unintended signals. A great example would be President Obama's mid-2009 speech at Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is very well known to Islamic scholars, people who study Islamic history, as sort of the seat of ideology very closely linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. So by picking that venue, you inadvertently, maybe unintentionally, maybe subconsciously, whatever it is, you, without communicating clearly, you send a signal to audiences, and a signal that you may not want to communicate. So I think the point is taken. We have to be very careful about not only what we say, but who we say it to and where we say it, because people are paying attention.
Thank you, Matthew Wallen, Fellow for Public Diplomacy at the American Security Project. I want to get a little bit into the discussion about credibility. And I think this gets into some of the ideas that have been brought up by the audience questioning. and this applies both at home and abroad, and is what tools or techniques are out there, or what methods of relationship building can we use to increase people's ability to discern whether information, whether that's coming from abroad or whether we are sending it abroad, is credible or not? Why is a person in Iran, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia going to choose to listen to the United States and accept that word at face value when we're considering tearing up our own diplomatic agreements, when we don't always tell the truth about certain things? That's just how it is in this world. But how do we increase our credibility? How do we make people want to listen to us and then take that information and incorporate it into a thought process?
Anybody want to take that one on?
I do. I feel like I'm speaking too much, but no, I think it's a good point. I think it sort of goes back to the 1960s Edward R. Murrow model, right, in which he talked about the fact that the most compelling case for America can be made by objective reporting. And the reason he sort of, when he was director of USIA, he sort of testified on this. And the reason he made that claim was the conviction that he shared and that members of Congress at the time shared, that the American system is weighted sort of more positively in favor of individual liberty, in favor of freedom, in favor of free expression, than are the closed systems into whom you are messaging, right? So I don't think it's accurate to think about public diplomacy towards Iran or towards any other place, as to any other constrained environment, as a zero-sum game. But it is true that there is a very strong positive correlation between local support for the credibility of the Islamic Republic, for example, and the openness of the audience to hear alternative views, right? So the more the Iranian government looks venal and corrupt and radical, the more the people who don't ascribe to that form of organization, the more they look for alternative models, right? So in this particular context, the Murrow model still works really well, in the sense that the more we can do objective, credible reporting on Iranian regime corruption, on the fact that the IRGC is running away with the national economy, that they're spending more money on guns than butter, whatever it is, the better we look by comparison, right? And I think that's important. And the point is, you're never going to pull the wool over the eyes of local populations who are much more sort of attuned to local conditions and to sort of nuances that you're not seeing as a foreign broadcaster. But in terms of, in particular, ideological regimes, the ill effects of those ideological regimes on their local populations is something that we can and should leverage in order to increase our credibility.
Anyone else?
That's a really good point, because people do have a sense of what's going on in their local communities. And I think actually the program that we were talking about, or I'd say it's a news network by now, Current Time, directed at the Russian-speaking populations around Russia and in Russia, do something similar. They focus on local issues. They focus on stories that Russians normally don't hear, but obviously ring true once they see them reported within their own context. And that's a way where you can judge whether what you're being fed is the truth or not. So those are definitely important. But I think also, we sometimes, the United States takes a big beating around the world because it's kind of, still the lone superpower, and there are lots of people who would like to see that change. But there are also lots of people around the world who still really root for American values and Americans, and it is we sometimes, I think, get ourselves in a bubble where we feel that nobody will believe anything we say, but I really don't think that's necessarily the case. The United States is viewed favorably in a great many places, and for good reason.
Any other questions? Do you have anything you'd like to say in your closing?
I'm just go back, sort of connect a couple of strings here. One on the China Daily issue, then also the issue that you raised. In my view, with like China Daily and CCTV or whatever they have a new name, I think, these days. But these aren't that. In my view, they're transparent. And so you generally know where they're coming from. And in terms of reading or viewing, it's not an issue because you know exactly, or should know exactly what they represent. The real problem are the ones that aren't quite so transparent. And the thing to really watch out for is when you have media structures here in the U.S., large groups, and you look at ownership, and you look at editorial, sort of looking at editorial bias. It's not necessarily in the large papers, the large groups, but looking at basically some degree of control that is not as transparent as it could be. In my view, this is a more significant problem. Transparency, long as if we have a free society and open society and a free media, then I think we should be free to choose what media outlets that we want to read. The problem isn't when there's not transparency.
Ella, do you want to say anything to?
I had just one last last remark on your point about not getting enough international news when you turn on your and how we need to go to other news outlets. I think to get a sense of what's going on in the world, I think that's a valid indictment of a lot of American media, that we could do a lot better in terms of covering the international scene. I don't necessarily feel that I need to get that from a foreign broadcaster. I feel that our own news networks ought to do a better job of bringing the world to Americans. That's all I had to aside on that point.
Yeah, just sort of an addendum to sort of what I talked about. I talked a lot about sort of the baseline criteria that the administration should think about when it is thinking about the battle of ideas in the Muslim world. The one thing that I think just for the brevity of time I didn't include, but I think it should be mentioned just for the sort of the fullness of the argument, is allies and sort of the role that allies, both nation states and also private corporations, can play. A great example of this would be Google. So Google and Facebook, to a lesser extent, Twitter to a lesser extent, are doing some very innovative things in terms of off-ramping potential radicals who are sort of go online to search for radicalized content. Google has this method called redirect, which so for all of you that go on Google, if you search a certain search criteria, the results that pop up first tend to be sponsored results, right? They're elevated in the algorithm. Google internally has sort of reworked some of their algorithms so that if people search for certain keywords like Islamic State or Daesh or whatever it is, they get different results that they think will guide them to where they want to go, but in fact sort of guide them to countervailing narratives. That's a pretty innovative approach to thinking about how to sort of asymmetrically amplify what the U.S. is trying to do directly. And frankly, the more the U.S. leverages that sort of corporate involvement and that sort of third-party action, the better, right? Because U.S. public diplomacy is, as I sort of said before, is not a Swiss Army knife, right? It's not intended to do a whole bunch of things. But as the administration begins to think more holistically about where it fits in terms of the different domains of warfare, it's not all about us, right? There's other people who are doing good work, and the more we can agglomerate that into our efforts, the more robust our own efforts will be.
With that, I'll close the panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a rich and thoughtful discussion. Panel is adjourned.
Thank you.